Chapter 20. Your name is what? As I stated before, the Lord really does have an awesome sense of humor. He is hip, funny, and knows how to speak your language. I had gone from being a landlord and having tenants to becoming a tenant again. My new landlord's last name was Sober, Sober. I have not changed her last name. When she first identified herself, when I called initially, I said, "What did you say your last name was?" She said, "It is Sober." I think, I said, that's really funny. I knew in my heart that God was speaking through this woman, and that is what He was wanting me to do. Get sober. I wish I could say that it was that easy. I just quit smoking weed altogether. However, my deliverance from drugs had been a gradual thing, and it did not happen overnight. Many profound things were happening inside me during my stay in this apartment. I was coming out of a living nightmare and trying to make sense of it all. The best way I can explain it is to say that the Lord was beginning to unravel me, like layers of an onion, and delivering me from one demon at a time. It was now time for me to be a human being and not a human doing. I had never done any reading, and I started to read books on deliverance, demons, and spiritual warfare. I knew my job in the water business was boot camp for understanding the demonic realm. In the next few chapters, I'll share many of my experiences. None of these could have been absorbed in a book. This was hands-on training. I also never had any need to use the computer. All of my work in the past was selling, turning in paperwork, and dealing with financing. All computer work was done for me. I was afraid of this technology, and now I had an opportunity to get free help and training. I remember walking into the workforce development, and I had so much brain damage from pot that I could barely type my name. This is also why I had a hard time reading. I had a problem with comprehension. Smoking massive amounts of weed for long periods of time shoots short-term memory, and it does cause brain damage. I had started attending another church and was spending a lot of time in prayer. I also was forced to look at myself in the mirror and try to figure out who I was. There was nothing that I could hide behind because everything had been stripped away. God had to knock down the house with His fire to rebuild His new foundation. Even though I knew in my heart that forgiveness was a really big thing, I still had many people that deep down I hated, including myself. I had a very hard time forgiving me for the things that had occurred. However, the Lord was teaching me several lessons on forgiveness, His judgment, and form of justice. I heard through people that I was in contact with that the pastor of the old church, Lance, had raped the church financially. He had embezzled one elderly woman of over $40,000. He had ruined the credit rating of the church, and his dealings were now being exposed all over town. The church was left in massive debt, and the people did not have the money to pay the bills that had been run up. Just as the Lord had said to me, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay. It is not your job." Many involved in the church cover-up developed severe health problems. The overseer who was paid to cover up the theft ended up with heart problems. Lance's mother ended up with breast cancer. I never heard what happened to the father or others in the upper echelon of this denomination, but nothing would surprise me. It took almost 3 years, but once again, everything came out in the wash. Lance was truly under the judgment of God. His wife left him, he lost his preaching license, and his kids wanted nothing to do with him because they were afraid of him. He was also under investigation by the IRS and other legal authorities. As we suspected, he had been embezzling money from small churches all over the country. Part of me was jumping up and down, happy that all this took place, and the other part of me was sick about it. Now the people left in this congregation had to deal with their bitterness and the reality that they were warned and did not listen. What took place in this church was so demonically inspired that it still blows my mind. The bite of the religious spirit is that of a poisonous snake, and it takes much healing and deliverance to get free of the hurt and pain that it causes its victims. I knew Lance was demonized because I could see it in his eyes. He could never give me direct eye contact. He always would look down. I'm an intense person, and I was taught as a child to look people directly in the eyes. I recall my father teaching me that, and when I would mumble or look away from his eyes, he knew I was lying or doing wrong. The irony of the tragedy that occurred at this church is that now God was asking me to intercede for these people and see them set free from what had taken place. As I always did and still do, I was writing 12 other ministries along, asking them to agree in prayer. Much of the congregation had become so bitter that it was causing health problems. A new pastor was sent to the congregation, and the Lord started to turn things around. Another thing that happened with Delilah, the woman that told my secret after the TV interview, had personal tragedy occur in her life. 2 of her children had died within a short period of time. One was murdered, and the other one was found dead, frozen in his car after falling asleep in a drug-induced coma. I truly had to let all the feelings that I had for her out, and now I pitied her for her loss. I felt the same way about Lance and all the people in the congregation that badmouthed me. It became easier to pray for him because this was no laughing matter. Also during this time, something else that took place that had a profound impact on me, and I still think about this to this day. I was in Mishawaka, Indiana, doing some shopping one day. The Lord had told me to go and pray for Harold's father that had been in a nursing home for a few years. The nursing home was right next to the shopping mall. I told God, I'll do it next week. Within that week, his father passed away. I feel that he went to hell. I sense that the Lord wanted me to pray with him and ask him to accept Christ. I had done that several years ago, but I do not think that his father took it seriously because he laughed off the prayer. He had always been religious, but had never been saved or had a relationship with Christ. He was the classic stereotype of many that take up spaces in pews of churches. He was on the membership roll, he was an usher, and wore a polyester suit and tie on Sunday. However, if he had bumped into Jesus, he would not have recognized or acknowledged him. Very shortly after, Harold's mother passed away as well. I had kept in contact with her, even though she never really liked me. In a bizarre way, it brought closure to many things that occurred. I do have peace that his mother came to the Lord, but I have no peace that his father did. I have the blood on my hands from that, and I've never forgotten it. As I stated before, the economy in Michigan was already in trouble several years ago, before the reorganization of General Motors. I was collecting unemployment and kept getting extensions, which lasted almost 2 years. It was a fraction of what I was making previously, but I was beginning to learn to live very cheap. Eventually, I started to look for another job, and every door I walked into closed. It came to the point that I could not even get a job as a waitress. The only thing I knew to do was to go back to the water business. I answered ads with the same company I had worked for 16 years. I interviewed in Indianapolis, was offered the job, but did not like the man that was hiring. I turned down the offer. I then interviewed in Minneapolis, and they did not like me. The third job choice was listed in Omaha, Nebraska. I called them up, told them who I was, and was hired over the phone. This was the corporate store, so they had access to my sales records. They also called Jim, and he gave me an excellent reference. They also did a background check and found no record. I, to this day, cannot explain that other than God erased my prison time. I never had been required to have a background check in the other jobs, and I would have to say that it's another case of the Lord supernaturally covering me. Little did I know that this was God's way of getting me where He wanted me and getting me out of Michigan before the financial collapse.